what are you saying? You're saying that this is really the shroud that Jesus was covered in? So you're saying Jesus historically absolutely did exist, and we think that this is the shroud that covered him.
Recently, Joe Rogan sat down with Mel Gibson, and they had an extensive conversation, but there were two topics that did arise that I found very interesting. One being about the resurrection, and is it in fact, historical event that took place? As well as the other discussion that came up was surrounding the Shroud of Turin. And is this, in fact, the same cloth that wrapped Jesus up when he was put in the tomb for 3 days? Now, with that being said, guys, in today's video, we're going to dive into these two topics, and we're going to see what Mel Gibson has to say to Joe Rogan about these two topics.
So are you doing this with historians as well? Are you trying to make it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, historical stuff. Well, I regard the Gospels as history. It's verifiable history. Some people say, oh, it's a fairy tale. He never existed, but he did. And there are other accounts, verifiable historical accounts outside the biblical ones that also bear this up, that yes, he did exist. And the other aspect of that is that all the evangelists, the apostles who went out there, every single one of those guys died rather than deny their belief. And nobody dies for a lie. Nobody.
Right.
So that's part of what I'm doing. It's like showing nobody dies for a lie.
Now, to catch you up real quick, guys, this conversation is coming up because they're discussing Mel Gibson's working on the film called The Resurrection. Now, Mel Gibson is known for the very famous movie called The Passion of Christ. And so that movie now, he's making a second one going through the resurrection of Christ and what that looked like after he rose from the grave. Now, Joe Rogan and Mel Gibson are going to kind of get deeper on this conversation surrounding the resurrection.
Yeah. Well, the resurrection is the one that is the most difficult for people to swallow.
Yes.
That's the one that requires the most faith.
The most faith and the most belief. Yeah, resurrection.
Yeah.
Who gets back up 3 days later after he gets murdered in public? Who gets back up under his own power? Buddha didn't do that shit.
Right.
You know. So.
You believe that was a real event?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
What brought you to that belief? Is this something that you've always had, or is it something you studied it and you've come to this conclusion because of the historical account?
And so we're seeing Joe Rogan go from a extreme atheist who mocked Christians to now willing to engage with guys like Wes Huff and have a deeper conversation surrounding the evidence and proof of the scriptures and the evidence and proof of the man Jesus Christ. And now Mel Gibson's going to elaborate more on how he came to faith in Christ.
So as a child, you learn these things and you accept them on faith. And I still have that faith, but as I got older, I came to it through intellect and through reading and putting things together in accounts, and then occurrences like in my own life, you know. I mean, just recently they verified the Shroud of Turin. Have you seen that?
I've been reading about it, and I know that there's some contention, there's some discussion and debate about it, but they used to think that it was only a couple hundred years old.
Yeah.
And now they've changed that.
Yeah, they've said, no, it's back then.
They also don't understand how it was made, which to me is very fascinating, because it's not paint. It's not, they don't know what caused the image itself and how that technology would have even been available.
It wasn't, no.
A couple thousand years ago.
An intense light, I mean, atomic, to leave almost like a photographic imprint on a piece of cloth.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big misconception for a lot of people who look at Christians and go, how can you believe this? You're just believing blindly. The reality is, guys, is Christians are not believing blindly. We're Christians and we believe in faith, but we also believe because there is true evidence that points to proof of what we're reading in the scriptures. There is verified evidence. We have that and we can hold on to that and say, hey, we're not just believing some type of made-up fairy tale story, but we're actually believing something that legitimately took place and happened. And so now they're having this discussion around the Shroud of Turin.
And you can see it, that it depicts a first century Hebrew male, because the hairstyle was from the first century, and a Hebrew hairstyle, that he was about 6 feet tall, that he was completely scourged all over his body. He was crucified. Yeah. Scourged, beaten,
Yeah.
the wounds on the thorns, the hands, the feet, and the scourging. And the hairstyle was from the first century. And the pollens that they found in the cloth were from that region.
Yeah.
Also, the weave was a first century weave that was typical. And another guy, an archaeologist who I knew, who actually translated the Passion into Aramaic, told me that if you look close, you can see the image of a Tiberius coin marks on the eyes. Now, I don't know if that's real or not. I've never actually checked that, but that there's images of Tiberius on the coin.
So they would put the coins over the eyes?
Yeah. So that would date it. But they have now verified that it does actually go back to that time period. For a while, they were testing pieces that had been repaired in the 13th century.
Now, at the end of the day, guys, the Shroud of Turin is going to either be believed that it is in fact the cloth that had wrapped Jesus up when he was put in the tomb for 3 days. And then there's the crowd that just won't believe that. Now, the thing with the Shroud of Turin that's getting more and more interesting is how it is pointing back to Christ more and more as they do studies on this material. It's very interesting. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that this, in fact, did wrap Jesus when he was put in the tomb for 3 days, but it is very interesting that the evidence is getting closer and closer to Christ. Now, we also need to be clear. If somehow we're able to prove, yes, this was in fact the cloth that wrapped up Jesus when he was put in the tomb for 3 days. This doesn't, verify that he was raised on the third day. This just verifies that he was crucified and he was put in the tomb and he was wrapped up. That's what it verifies. And so Joe Rogan is going to kind of give his final conclusions and thoughts on the Shroud of Turin.
It's such a crazy thing to even try to verify. What are you saying? You're saying that this is really the shroud that Jesus was covered in? So you're saying Jesus historically absolutely did exist, and we think that this is the shroud that covered him. That alone, people, incredulity, people's immediately their hackles raise, like, wait a minute, and they just instead of like looking at it objectively, they almost always want to look at it from a point of view of disproving it immediately, dismissing it immediately.
But that's science, isn't it? You have to sort of you play the devil's advocate, and that's okay. Go for it.
And that's exactly what it is, guys. I mean, there are going to be plenty of people out there who just will not humbly look at the evidence. They will just disagree because they don't want it to be true and they want nothing to do with it. And we see that. But we need to be faithful and just say, hey, listen, let's see if this is real. Let me put the scriptures to test. Let me put the life of Christ to test. Let me put the resurrection, the crucifixion, all those things to the test. Let's find the evidence. Let's do our due diligence and search and see, is this in fact true or is it a fairy tale? And when you come at it with that attitude, you will find out that the evidence is clear.